All right, let's see if we can pick up the thread here at the start of Seminar 18. But wait, let's pick it up by tracing it back to an origin that we've discussed in our series on Seminar 17. I'm looking here now at Seminar 17 at what I believe to be a key passage for understanding that barrier, that logical obstacle between truth and production in any given discourse. And again, you can go back and review our lectures on 17 and hear this developed more fully. The passage I want to call your attention to, though, briefly, is just to put us on this thread that can allow us to enter into Seminar 18 and make some progress on this crucial conceptual relationship between the truth and the real for Lacan, and the real here as connected to the unconscious, like truth, but the real here as a statement of impossibility, which is exactly what we see in the half-sayings that emerge in and as and from the unconscious. So let's see what we can make of this. Page 108, Seminar 17. I realize this is a series on Seminar 18, but sometimes you got to go back a couple steps in order to take a few more giant steps forward. You know the passage I'm referring to if you studied Seminar 17 with us. It's on 108, and it's the passage in which Lacan gives us that delta that I've been talking to y'all about. In the Master's Discourse, here it is, that Master's Discourse again. Since it is all the same there that surplus jouissance is situated in the lower right-hand quadrant as little a, there is no relationship between what will more or less become the cause of desire for a character like the master, there's that objet a that is the product of the master's commandment to the slave, who as usual fails to understand anything about it and what constitutes his truth. There's the master's ignorance of the truth of his or her barred subjectivity. So what you see is a barrier between the cause of the master's desire as figured or symbolized by objet a in the lower right-hand quadrant of the Discourse of the Master, and what constitutes his truth, namely barred subjectivity in the lower left. Between the two, there is no relationship. As a matter of fact, Lacan continues on page 108 of Seminar 17, there is a barrier here on the lower level. That is what this delta between truth and production, this delta of impotence, of weakness, hear me, castration, is. It's a barrier. The barrier which we are within reach of naming, and you can see it right there on page 108 of Seminar 17 again, so check it out. At the level of the Master's Discourse is jouissance, quite simply insofar as it is prohibited fundamentally. One takes jouissance by morsels, but as for going right to the end, I have already told you how that is embodied. No need to reactivate lethal fantasies. So in the bottom part of the Discourse of the Master, you have two figures of enjoyment. There is surplus enjoyment, as symbolized by objet a in the lower right, and then this forbidden, prohibited enjoyment, an enjoyment that only ever exists as prohibited, that we call sexual enjoyment. The sexual enjoyment, sexual jouissance. Lacan doesn't always say which jouissance he's talking about, but as you saw in our series on 17, it's very important and incredibly useful to keep those distinctions in mind and to always ask yourself, when he says jouissance in the late 60s, early 70s, is it sexual as forbidden, prohibited jouissance, or is it surplus enjoyment, which is precisely what is not forbidden, but in fact enabled, encouraged, and in fact pursued without restraint at the level of morsels of sexual jouissance, morsels of real enjoyment. emphasis on the use of the word real here. So we can locate this prohibited, forbidden jouissance, prohibited fundamentally in that delta, in that barrier that you see between truth and production in every discourse. It's not coincidental, as you heard me say in the last lecture, that looking at the lower part of the Discourse of the Master, you see a version of fantasy, the matheme of fantasy with the barred subject, lozenge next to little a. It's not coincidental, and you'll see when the Discourse of the Analyst, which is the inverse, the torsion or the torque, the Mobius flip side of the Discourse of the Master, you'll see that that fantasy then becomes foregrounded, becomes paramount, albeit in perverted form, where objet a delta barred subject is now the fantasy that gets trotted out. Now, I don't think Lacan is tweaking it so much as to say that this is the pervert's fantasy that the analyst trots out when they hystericize the master. But what he is suggesting is that there's something about analytic experience that calls the master's unconscious fantasy and the breakage between his split subjectivity and the cause of his desire into question. Now, everything you've just heard in the past 30 seconds assumes that you have been on board throughout Seminar 17. I have to assume that at some point because we just don't have time to go back and rehash all this stuff, already getting back into page 108. I'm tempted to make this entire lecture a rereading of page 108. I can't do that shit. We already covered page 108. But it's great here for us because it gives us an origin, a source point for that thread that we're trying to trace into Seminar 18 again, around truth and the real. And crucially, remember, the real as a statement of impossibility. That statement of impossibility also, I believe, occupies this delta of impotence that you see in every single discourse between truth and production, here well figured on page 108. It's not the only place in Seminar 17 where you can see that delta or that barrier popping up, but it becomes a hot spot in the theory of discourse that we are developing here in Lectures on Lacan, because it precisely allows us to designate the relationship, I believe, between truth and the real in Lacan's theory of discourse. And with that designation, the opportunity structure to think a discourse that might not be a semblance. So I am not fucking around when I go back to these passages. I'm doing it with a very careful eye to Seminar 18, even though we're only a couple chapters in, and to where I think Lacan might be headed here. Remember, I haven't read Seminar 18. I am, like you, only a couple chapters into this thing. Another passage, though, comes to mind for me in Seminar 17. It's on page 123. It's a page that got a lot of attention in our series on 17, and by God, if it's not worth queuing up here, around this very unique approach to the real that we're trying to carve out here, that Lacan himself is laying in front of us in Radiophony when he talks about not just the real as impossible, but the real presented as the impossible. In other words, in language. That's the key point here. That's what we're trying to get at. That delta is subject to signifying articulation of a certain kind. Doesn't make it a semblance, but this is a discourse we're talking about. It's a part of discourse, a fifth foot, if you want to take it as seriously as I believe it ought to be taken. This delta of impotence, this barrier, this obstacle between truth and production. Let me show you one of several passages in the previous seminar, Seminar 17, where Lacan is very clear on this point. It's on page 123. It's the last full paragraph. Lacan is here again on the topic of jouissance as prohibited, which means he's talking about sexual jouissance, not surplus jouissance, which is allowed all too often, but sexual jouissance, which is constitutively prohibited. It doesn't exist except as prohibited. and its prohibitions don't exist except as reaffirmed by those to whom it applies. Hence, what Lacan is doing with Freud's myth of the father of the primal horde in Seminar 17. It's not the father's commandment that marks prohibition. It's the son's reaffirmation and acceptance of that commandment. His "you must" becomes their "we desire," "we will." We've been over this, but it's precisely in the spirit of that discussion that we are calling our attention to 123. This barrier between truth and production and discourse, this barrier of impotence, of limitation, is where the real is designated, is named, is stated, the way that unconscious, when emerges, states itself as impossible. The fact that the dead father, here we're talking about the father of the primal horde as a mythical figure, is jouissance, namely forbidden sexual jouissance, presents itself to us as a sign of the impossible itself. That's what that delta is. It is a sign of the impossible. And in this way, we rediscover here the terms that are those I define as fixing the category of the real, insofar as in what I articulate, it is radically distinguished from the symbolic and the imaginary. The real is the impossible. Now, y'all hear that, and you start thinking, oh, this lines up is exactly what I know of the real. It is radically distinct from the symbolic and the imaginary. We start thinking about all that shit. I do too sometimes. But notice where Lacan goes from here. Yes, the real is the impossible. But hang tight. Not in the name of a simple obstacle we hit our heads against. The real is impossible, but not like a brick wall. He's not going toward raw materiality here. Not in the name of a simple obstacle we hit our head up against, but in the name of the logical obstacle of what, in the symbolic, declares itself to be impossible. This is where the real emerges from. Page 123, Seminar 17. The reason why I call your attention to this is that yes, the real is the impossible. Yes, it can be a brute, startling experience of raw materiality, unmediated through language. And yet, where the real originates, where we see the real also, is not just in the snake that comes out from under the rock and latches on to your ankle. Nah, man, the real is also a logical obstacle within the symbolic. A place in the symbolic where we can declare impossibility. The real is that part of the symbolic that declares itself to be impossible. Isn't this precisely how Lacan is figuring the unconscious in that passage in Radiophony that we've been discussing? The real is not a brute material obstacle like a brick wall, but a logical, linguistic obstacle. Not separate from, but integral to the symbolic. In fact, if you follow this series, you know what I think about this. The real is the constitutive void around which the entire symbolic apparatus turns. It's not just an excess. It's certainly not an exterior. It's in fact the internal limit within the symbolic that gives the symbolic its very condition. Its totalizing effort can only be sustained insofar as nothing runs errantly throughout it. You've heard me say this many, many times. This is what Lacan is getting at when he talks about statements of impossibility, the name of the real. The real, hear me now, is in the symbolic. It is not exterior to the symbolic. The real is a figure of errancy, a statement of impossibility, an error message in the symbolic. It's a statement of impossibility. This is where the real emerges from, Lacan says. We could go on reading up into Lacan working this as the name of the real, statement of impossibility. It keeps coming up again in Seminar 17. We've been there, we've done that. I want to leave it aside for now in order to get back to this question. What then is the declaration of impossibility, the statement of impossibility, the pronouncement of the prohibition against sexual jouissance that is this delta between truth and production? What is its relationship to truth? This is also one of the questions that we asked in our series on Seminar 17. What's the relationship between the name of the real and the truth in every discourse that is the unconscious? Now, that's a heady-ass question for us to be working with, but what other question would you want to ask than a heady one in here? Here's what we have so far, and I want to recall one more thing from Seminar 17 to make this point. Truth, according to Lacan, is the sister of impotence. The delta of impossibility, marking a statement of one's limitations, a statement beyond which they can talk no further, a statement beyond which discourse is abolished, where there is nothing more to say, all more or less direct quotes from Lacan's own work. These are siblings. These are sisters. For Lacan, truth is the sister of a forbidden sexual jouissance that finds expression in these statements of impossibility. Similarly, these statements of impossibilities, he says, are sisters of truth. So what we have so far, coming out of 17, starting 18, is a sibling-like relationship between truth and statements of impossibility, between the unconscious and the real. And we don't quite know how all this is going to play out. But I think we've got enough to suggest that if Lacan is indeed continuing his thought from 17, just as he continued his thought from 16 into 17, that we're on the right trail. So we're asking the question here of truth's relationship to that delta of impotence in every discourse, that barrier, that logical obstacle within the symbolic, where you see significations of the real popping between truth and production in any given discourse. Pretty heady stuff, pretty conceptual stuff. We've asked about that relationship between truth and these names of the real in a discourse. One way to get at this is by taking it from another side. Instead of asking about the relationship between truth and the delta of impotence, where we see the name of the real, statements of impossibility, sexual jouissance as prohibited, as prohibition, all things we've discussed in our previous series. Why not take this question from the other side and ask what's the relationship between production in a discourse and this delta of impotence, where we see statements of one's limitation, inconsistency, incompletion, read castration, pronounced? Well, the best way to do this, in my view, given where Lacan is and given the mentionings of surplus enjoyment that are still popping here at the start of 18, is to review the relationship between sexual enjoyment and surplus enjoyment. There's a lot in Lacanian literature on surplus enjoyment. Not exactly as we've been discussing it in close readings of Lacan's own work, but there's not a lot anywhere on sexual jouissance, this sister, sibling, maybe even the cousin of surplus enjoyment. The two are closely related. Lacan's metaphor, as he thinks then, is oftentimes of growth, of plant life. It's one of the underlying themes in 17. He talks a lot about plants in very key passages. Let me rephrase. He doesn't talk a lot frequently about plants in 17, but what he tells us when he talks about plants in 17 tells us a lot. Let me be clear about that. And what he says is that surplus enjoyment takes root in prohibitions of sexual enjoyment. They are not opposites. Sexual enjoyment as prohibited, which is all that it's ever been, it is simply a prohibition. That is the soil in which surplus enjoyment takes root, according to Lacan. It's a very organic botanical metaphor that he works with around their relationship. We would read them more along the lines of a Mobius strip. I think that's a more useful way to think of their relationship. It's not contrary. In fact, they are reciprocally constitutive, we determined in our reading of Seminar 17. But let's be very clear and see if we can sharpen this up a little bit. First, sexual jouissance, what we see in this delta in between truth and production in any given discourse. This is enjoyment insofar as it is prohibited. It's a statement or pronouncement or declaration of one's own limits, of one's own castration. You see, that's what castration also amounts to. Castration is a prohibition against any further pursuit of something that might qualify as the sexual. When you state those limits, when you declare yourself to be castrated, you are in that delta of impotence. What's amazing about this, as you may have heard me lecture elsewhere, is that this is not a problem. This is, in fact, the very thing that analytic experience cultivates in the analysand, is a love of these declarations, a love of the position known as impotence. This is exactly what analytic experience encourages, what Lacan on page 52 of Seminar 17 calls a love of weakness, that I'm sure you may have heard me talk on before. A love of weakness that Lacan says is the very essence of love. Again, you can review to those materials. The reason why I bring them up here is because I want you to know that this ain't a problem. That logical obstacle between truth and production is not a problem. In fact, it is the very thing that Lacan believes is a solution. The solution that brings us to the end of analysis, you've heard me say. Sexual jouissance, though, the important part here is that it is not an experience that can or ever will be had. That's not how it works. It only exists as a horizon that is blocked. It exists as a blocked horizon. It is not even a horizon. It is only the blockage. It's not what's behind the veil. It's the veil itself. That's what sexual jouissance is. It's a signifier, in other words. It's a signifier of one's castration, of a point beyond which further discourse becomes impossible. A declaration of a point where discourse is abolished and where nothing can be said. I want you to hear that in all senses. Nothing can indeed be said beyond this limit. Sexual jouissance is a declaration. It's a sign. It's a statement of the impossible. And here's the second part that we just pulled from Seminar 17. Within the field of language, of society, of the symbolic. Sexual jouissance is a declaration, sign, statement of the impossible. The same way that the name of the real is a declaration, sign, statement of the impossible that finds expression within the field of language. Society, the symbolic. In other words, within the very same field where surplus jouissance flourishes, like a weed. Sexual jouissance, a logical obstacle within the symbolic. You can tell I want to kick this horse even after it's dead, because it's an important point. It is a signed and posted limit that is just as indebted to signifying articulation as any other sociolinguistic entity. But it shows the signifier doing something different that allows Lacan to mark a distinction between this type of signifier use as a declaration of one's own limits and the semblance that is the master signifier popping off from the agency of the master. You want a phrase for this? We are not talking about the real. We are talking about its name. We are not talking about the real father. We are talking about the name of the real father. It's within language that Lacan is developing the origin of the real. How about an example? It's one you may have heard us riff on before, one you may have discussed in our previous series, but it's one that bears mentioning here because it's just so central to Freudian thought, especially later Freudian thought, and Lacan really makes great use of it, I believe, in his previous seminar, not irrelevant to where we're headed with 18. The exclusive enjoyment, inaugural prohibition, and subsequent murder of the father of the primal horde. You know this story? Exclusive enjoyment of all the women. This is the fantasy in Totem and Taboo, is that there was a daddy back in the day who had all the women. And all the sons produced by his having of those women were prohibited from partaking of that enjoyment that was exclusively his. So there's exclusive enjoyment of all women. The father's inaugural prohibition against the sons participating in that enjoyment. There's the classic no of the father. And then you've got this subsequent murder, where the sons kill the father, but then something weird happens. The sons kill the father of the primal horde, thereby canceling his exclusive enjoyment of all those women. And then they get together in this bizarre experience of brotherhood, of half-brotherhood perhaps. Lacan makes a bit of this in Seminar 17. And they decide, we are going to reaffirm Daddy's prohibition. His, you must not sleep with any of my ladies, becomes, we will not sleep with any of the ladies, even though Daddy is dead. Now, Lacan quips that, wait a minute, aren't these all just half-brothers? Couldn't they just run a pretty quick calculation and figure out which one is not their own mommy and then get after that? His point is that it's kind of like ridiculous. But isn't that exactly the broader message that we get here? All of this exclusive enjoyment, inaugural prohibition, subsequent murder is occurring at the level of a myth, a narrative, a fantastical figuration of impossibility, stated in the here and now of sociolinguistic life occupied by those sons. It's the sons who propagate the myth of the father's exclusive enjoyment of all the women, which Lacan also quips about this. What kind of fucking shit is that? That makes no sense. You're telling me there's one dude who has like hundreds of women? I mean, you may think that that sounds fabulous, whether you fantasize yourself as the woman or the man in that situation. Lacan is like, it sounds completely ridiculous. There's no way that that could ever work practically, logically, and certainly not in a way that would provide anybody with some substantial sense of enjoyment. So the idea that the dad would be the exclusive enjoyer of all the women, Lacan's like, this is just ridiculous. And that's precisely his point. It's a myth. This is not fact that he's talking about here. The real father is not a biological historical being in the world that was subsequently literally murdered. Nah, man. The real father is a narrative figure that the sons sustain in their own lives after the father has passed. It's a myth. It's part of their fantasy that sustains them, that allows their symbolic order to hang together. That's Lacan's point. So also with the inaugural prohibition. The no of the father is retroactively marked as original by the name of the father that the sons reaffirm. You see, this is how Lacan's always thinking with this stuff. My point in bringing it up is that we are talking about names of the real here. In this case, the real father. Names that emerge after the fact and then retroactively designate some sort of original moment, an original prohibition, a subsequent murder to that original prohibition, in what Lacan famously calls a second moment. It's these second moments where you see the real action around this topic. What this second moment sounds like, again, is the son's reaffirmation of the father's inaugural prohibition. It's the son's "we will" that retroactively establishes the father's "you must" as an original prohibition. You want to think like Lacan? Just replay that sentence in your head and see if you can keep with it. It's this retroactive, repetitive effect, a retroefficacy that we see happening. It's not that there was a "you must" and subsequently the sons accepted that. It's that their acceptance, their affirmation of that prohibition, their beya'un of that original prohibition, is what marks that prohibition as original. In a second moment, their "we will not sleep with all the women" is precisely what establishes the father's pronouncement, "you must not sleep with all the women," as an inaugural prohibition. The law of the father is retroactively affirmed by the acceptance of this law as the cause of the son's desire. Now, we're pushing hard. I'm not slowing down here. This is all stuff we've already discussed. This is really just a summary. And remember, what I'm trying to work at here is I eventually want to start talking about the relationship between sexual and surplus enjoyment to further get us into this triangle of impotence between truth and production in any given discourse. Let me be clear one more time, at the risk of putting my foot through a dead horse's bloated gut. The real father is nothing but his name, as inherited, as accepted, as reaffirmed in the sons. Now, the implications of this for understanding surplus enjoyment are really quite simple. And back to that botanical metaphor. It's out of these names of the Father. It's out of these statements of impossibility. It's out of these reaffirmations of an inaugural "thou shalt not" that surplus enjoyment grows. The sons, for instance, if you just want to keep toying with this image, they accept and reaffirm the father's inaugural prohibition, thereby marking it as original in a retroefficacy way. What do then? They don't sleep with the mommies, but they damn sure don't stop chasing ladies. That's where this metaphor is headed. Yes, they don't sleep with the mommies, but they still remain on this heteronormative path towards woman. And that's where they go. Woman, in this case, becomes an object of surplus enjoyment that supplements. Don't forget, supplement and surplus, they come from the same Proto-Indo-European root, pele, meaning to fill. They fill in for this void that is the prohibition of sexual enjoyment. That's what surplus enjoyment does. And it's a great way to keep with Lacan's botanical metaphor here. Sexual enjoyment isn't just the soil from which surplus enjoyment grows. Sexual enjoyment, Lacan talks about it like a plant pulled from the field, a flower cut, ripped from the soil. Sexual enjoyment is not the flower that's been ripped from the soil, however. It's the divot in the ground that this pulling of the plant leaves behind. And this is precisely where surplus enjoyment is planted, where it takes root. The cutting or the pulling of the flower of sexual jouissance, all that you have is the divot where the roots used to be, which is a terrific place to plant something else. And that's what surplus enjoyment is. The objects of surplus enjoyment Call them lat houses, call them commodities, call them little I, little a, if you've seen our series on 16. Call them what you will. These little objects that are the opportunities and the origins of surplus enjoyment, they are fundamentally metonymic substitutes for some flower that you imagine used to be there. But they always take root in precisely the same place where we see this hole in the ground. And that's a really important part of all this. The hole in the ground that marks sexual enjoyment as prohibited is precisely where surplus enjoyment takes root. And that's incredibly important here, as we're about to see, as we get into chapter 2 of Seminar 18, because the same logic starts to come up again around holes in the signifying articulation, the field of discourse, that are crucial to understanding Lacan's understanding of the relationship between truth and the real. So back up for a second. What do we got so far? We have a notion of the unconscious truth of the subject being one of castration. Sounds pretty standard, right? It's the discourse of the master. And that this unconscious truth structures the semblance of agency that we see in most ego formations. So this is not too much being said right here. It may sound like something, but it's really not much. It says that there is an unconscious lurking behind, beneath, within every ego formation. The unconscious truth of the subject, namely that they are barred, castrated like the rest of us, structures this semblance of ego agency that we see pronounced very well in the upper left-hand quadrant of the Discourse of the Master, which is precisely again where Lacan says in Seminar 18, the semblance should be located. Here we are operating in the field of signifying articulation, because that S1, if you've still got your image of discourse in front of you, is linked up with another signifier in this case, an S2. The reason why this matters is because it shows, once more, that unconscious truth is the cause of which the semblance of agency is an effect. That, again, is why I suggested that we draw an arrow from truth up to the agent. So you've got truth to agent to other to production, and then a stop, a barrier that is this delta of impotence. But truth to agent is where Lacan is focused here at the start of Seminar 18, because what he wants to show is that unconscious truth is the cause that enables this effect that is a semblance of agency, of authority, of omnipotence in the case of the master, of omniscience in the case of the university. Now, like I said, this isn't revealing much, but check out the turn. It is precisely here, however, and only here in the field of language, of S1s linking up with S2s, in this swarm of master signifiers, where we see signifying articulation occurring. It's precisely here in semblance that we can begin to designate what Lacan on page 20 in our PDF of Seminar 17 calls the primary function of truth. So yes, unconscious truth is the cause of an effect we understand as a semblance of agency, coherence, and authority, ego speech, empty speech. But it's precisely there in that field of semblance that we can begin to designate the primary function of truth. And that's what we're up to here. That field of signification, of signifying articulation, is where the real takes root. It's also where we can locate, again, quoting Lacan, the primary function of truth. Here's a question then. What then exactly, precisely, is the relationship between truth and semblance, the unconscious, if you want to figure it more broadly, and signification? This is the question that's in front of us, if you've got ears to hear what's cracking here. What exactly is the relationship between truth and semblance? We know that unconscious truth is the cause of a semblance of agency, which is its effect. Okay, that's fair enough. But what we're also realizing is that it's only within the field of semblance that we start being able to designate, signify, represent, if you even like, the primary function of truth. So notice, we're still dabbling with truth and the real. My goal here, despite the motto of our series, which is clear, coherent, and accessible readings of Lacanian psychoanalysis, is to have a little fun and take some chances while we are still so damn ignorant at the start of this seminar. We're 2 chapters in. We don't know what's coming next. Why not take a big risk? Why not take the risk of finding out a few chapters later that we're all completely wrong and having to admit it, having to admit that our insights at the early stages of this seminar were limited, that our insights were inaccurate, incoherent. Take that risk. Lacan sure as hell is taking that risk at his start of this seminar. Let me show you a passage though. Page 22. It's from chapter 2. It's page 22 of the PDF that we've been working with here. The question again, what's the relationship between truth and semblance? And I want you to notice what's happening here. I don't usually pause and take these formative breaks, but I kind of want to point this out to you because I know that some of you are just listening to this and you haven't been seeing the diagrams that I've been throwing up on the screen here. Throwing up on the screen, get it? But if you've got eyes to see, we've been banging around Lacan's theory of discourse in all of the 4 positions to try and figure out what this delta of impotence is. We've talked now about its relationship to truth, just a little bit. That's the primary stake. I don't think we're there yet. We backed off that and talked about its relationship to production. In the discourse of the master, surplus enjoyment is what is produced. And that's distinct from, but in a Mobius strip kind of way, connected to sexual enjoyment as a statement of the impossible, as prohibited. That's what we were up to, production and the delta of impotence. Now, rather than going back to truth and impotence, what I'm doing is I'm asking about truth's relationship to the agent again. You see, we're dancing around this fundamental site in Lacan's theory of discourse, where truth is connected somehow to statements of the impossible, to the real. We don't know what we're doing with this yet, which is why we're messing around with it. And now what we're doing is we're trying to take it from yet another angle. Here, the angle of the agent's relationship to truth, or truth's relationship to the semblance of agency, as you just heard me put it. Notice what Lacan does with this. Page 22, chapter 2 in Seminar 18. Truth is not the contrary of semblance. The truth, as I might say, is this dimension, or this dimension, if you will allow me to make up a new word. I'll let you all play with that one, see what you come up with. To designate these bowls, this dimension, which is strictly correlative to that of the semblance. This dimension, I told you that the latter, that of semblance, supports it. Semblance supports this dimension of truth that is correlative to it. They are corollary formations, corollary what Lacan would call structural operators. The nature of their relationship, in other words, is not so simple as a cause and effect, where the unconscious truth of the subject is the cause of their semblance of agency. It's not so simple as that. There's a correlation between them that Lacan has yet to reveal to us. And yet, I believe, if you back up to the very start of Seminar 18, where Lacan is talking about the relationship between the master and the analyst, and he's suggesting that this is a torsion that doubles as a Mobius strip, I think that that is the correlation that Lacan is talking about here. So I want to let you know that I'm not just making up this correlative relation as one of a Mobius strip. It is coming from pages 2 to 3 of Seminar 18 in the PDF that we're using for this text. So you can go there and you can read these pages and you can see how Lacan correlates these two items. The reason why this matters is not just because it puts us on the trail to the title of Seminar 18, but because it fundamentally reveals to us, again, why Lacan chose as the title of Seminar 17, the other side of psychoanalysis, the reverse or the inverse side of psychoanalysis. The nature of that other inverse reverse is that of a Mobius strip. The inverse or the other side of psychoanalytic discourse, again, is the discourse of the master. And the correlation between them is that of a Mobius strip. Anyway, I'll let you check it out on your own, but I think we're on track here to understanding what Lacan did with Seminar 17 in its title, but also putting us on the trail of a discourse that might not be a semblance. All of that, you see, that latter part, it just seems so vague and cloudy at this point. Good. That's exactly where we want to be. Because it's precisely there that we can take the big risks. It's precisely there that we might come up with something new, that we can generate a new insight, perhaps an incorrect one. But the whole goal of keeping with it is that you can correct these mistakes perhaps only in hindsight, when you're further into the seminar, and you can line things up a little better. Once more, if you want to think like a Lacanian, this is one way to get after it. This is how Lacan thinks. This is the reason why he's so difficult to read as a theorist. He doesn't just show up with an idea ready to go. He develops that shit. And then in the next year, the next seminar, the next session even, he goes back and changes his mind, tries something different. This is one of the most organic thinkers you can study. And that's the reason why we have lectures on Lacan, so that we can get into that organic flow with him and learn how to think a little differently, read a little differently, be a little differently. So this correlation between truth and semblance I'm submitting is a torsion. The same type of torsion that you see in a Mobius strip. And you could, if you wanted to get crazy with Professor McCormick here, you could go ahead and make one for yourself. Now I'm holding up this diagram. I don't know why I did this. I don't know, man. Too much coffee, not enough coffee. Who can I blame for whatever the hell this thing is? If you take a look at this, though, you will probably find it rather familiar. Here is the discourse of the master, resulting in the production of objet A, which then is inhabited by the analyst. And here's the discourse of the analyst, hystericizing the master and forcing them to cough up a master signifier, perhaps one that would grind associations to a halt in other conditions. And that becomes an opportunity for the master's discourse to launch again, resulting in the production of a new A, which in turn becomes another opportunity for the analyst. Now, some of you are listening to this right now, perhaps even looking at it on the screen with the benefit of seeing the diagram, and you're like, stop, just stop it. Why are you doing this? This is not cool, man. This is neither clear, coherent, or accessible. Yeah, but hold on a second. I believe that if we just add one more confusion, we can bring the element of clarity that shows you how these two discourses are linked by way of torsion, resulting in a Mobius strip. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fold these discourses. They remain connected, but I am folding them into a single two-sided strip that you can then bring right back around and connect. Now, this is not your usual Mobius strip, but I'm telling you that if you follow the surfaces of this topology that I'm working with here, you will see the same torsion that shows you what exactly Lacan means by the corollary between truth and semblance. Here, we see it between two discourses. On page 22 of Seminar 18, Lacan is saying that truth and semblance have a similar relationship. That's how I'm reading his use of correlative here. As we continue to blast forward, into Seminar 18. We're only about 20 pages into this thing, but already we have an illustration of what Lacan is doing here. Truth, semblance, the real, statements of the impossible, holes in signifiers, in fields of signification. What the hell is going on here? He knows at this point things are probably getting a little loopy for folks here in January of 1971. At the bottom of page 23, he tries to come a little bit clean here. Our discourse, our scientific discourse, only discovers the real because of the fact that it depends on the function of semblance. Now you've got something else to add to this pipe that I'm asking you to smoke. You've got truth in a correlative, torsion-like, Mobius strip-esque relationship to semblance. And now he's throwing the real in there too. Notice, in the previous page that we looked at, he said that the dimension or the dimension of truth, I told you that that of the semblance supports it. So the semblance supports the dimension of truth. And now look what he's saying here. Our scientific discovery or discourse only discovers the real because of the fact that it depends on the function of the semblance. What he seems to be suggesting here is that the semblance supports the dimension known as truth as well as that phenomenon known as the real. Very interesting here. We're getting close to something that might bring us some clarity to the relationship between these entities. The big page for us, though, and the one I want to call your attention to very directly, is page 24, because here I think the whole thing starts to spin out. Not in an unproductive way. In fact, in a way that launches Lacan into discussions of the sexual relation, lack thereof, sexual act, lack thereof, trans bodies, animal philia, phylums, and the like, passaging to the act. He's even got, trigger warning here. What this spin out I'm about to call your attention to leads to is some pretty wild shit that Lacan says about the limits of discourse. Insofar as someone might strive to make their semblances hold up, and yet, nevertheless, encountering a real disruption. I'll let you sort through that business. Personally, for my money, I think the best page for us to focus on is the spin out itself. Not the weird flourish, smart, but weird flourish that follows. But here on page 24, this passage where he tries to describe the difference between the real as encountered and placed, designated by scientific discourse. He's thinking physics probably. And this notion of the truth that is part and parcel of what the psychoanalyst tries to designate. He is not yet letting these two things go together. Let's see what we can do with this. Like I said, it's a spin out, so hang on, y'all. The effects of what I call the algebraic articulation of the semblance, and as such it is only letters that are at stake, is the only system by means of which we designate what is real. What is real is what makes a whole in this semblance. That is what Lacan means by logical obstacle, the name of the real, the statement of the impossible. The real is a whole in the field of signification, in the symbolic. Similarly, the real is what makes a whole in this semblance. Now, I don't like the real as the thing that makes the whole. I much prefer to read the real as the whole. In this articulated semblance, which is scientific discourse progresses without even asking itself anymore whether or not it is semblance. It is simply a question of whether its network, its net, its lattice, as they say, makes the wholes appear in the right place. So scientific discourse, when done well, and by well you know what I mean, hysterically, in all senses. Scientific discourse, when done well, it designates the wholes in semblance that are the real, that according to Lacan, are made by the real. And it does so in a way that accurately locates them. Scientific discourse is what tells you where the divot in the field is. Whether it also is what allows you to plant a bit of surplus enjoyment in that divot remains to be seen. But the point here is that that hole in the field of signification that is the prohibition of sexual jouissance that we've been talking about, drawing on this botanical metaphor from Seminar 17, is here again. And scientific discourse, according to Lacan, is at its best when it designates those holes. Now, why do I say that this is hysterical? Not just because it's hilarious, but because it is also revealed in the discourse of hysteria, as you heard me in our lectures on Seminar 17 and that part about hysteria. The hysteric's discourse confronts the master and compels them to admit that they are lacking in the field of knowledge. In other words, that there is a hole in their omnipotence, in their omniscience, because the hysteric confronts the professor just as often as they confront power. The goal, though, in each case is to prove that these figures don't have what they say they have. The master is weak. They do not have omnipotence. The professor is ignorant. They do not have omniscience. And the hysteric is what forces these masters of knowledge of others to admit this, to name it. Name your lack. Designate. Show me where you're ignorant. This is why, in part, hysteria and science couple so well together here in this discussion. Scientific discourse is hysterical discourse because it finds the holes in the semblances of agency that masters and professors put forth, and it accurately compels the master to map that shit. It accurately compels the professor to designate that shit. Show me where your hole is. Now, the drama of the hysteric is, I could fill that hole, but I won't do it for you. You'd love it if I filled your hole, but I'm not going to do it for you. And you know that this is also why the hysteric is on the spectrum with the pervert. Not to blur clinical substructures here, but what I'm suggesting is that what the pervert freely gives to the other, namely themselves as an object that could plug the hole in the master's so-called omnipotence, in the professor's semblance of omniscience, the hysteric willfully withholds. The hysteric says, you've shown me the hole in your omnipotence, dear master. Professor, you've shown me. We've designated. We've marked the hole in your omniscience, where you are ignorant. I could fill that in and make you whole, but I won't. And this, of course, is the truth that the hysteric often ignores, is that they get off on being the missing object that could bring wholeness and completion to the other. But the hysteric refuses and withholds that. That's why in the position of truth, in the discourse of the hysteric, you see objet. Now that's quick and dirty, and at the same time not dirty enough. Just review our discourse on hysterics. In our previous seminar on 17, I believe the lecture is pretty clearly labeled. You can see all this being played out. And it's not a novel insight either. Science and hysteria, they've gone together for quite a while. And some of the best readers of Lacan, like Bruce Fink, for instance, make a really good fuss about this in the best, most productive way. Here, the science Lacan is thinking of is a hysterical science because it is very good at accurately making these holes appear in the right place in their discourse, very accurately designating them. The only reference, Lacan continues, is the impossible, at which these deductions culminate. This impossible is real. The apparatus of discourse, insofar as it is what in its rigor encounters the limits of its consistency. It is with this that we aim. In physics, there it is, physics, at something that is real. We can aim at something real, by using science not to generate knowledge as epistemology, as a closed system, but instead as Lacan understands knowledge, as a process, as an open-ended process, a process that is always opening onto its own inconsistency, the holes that it cannot fill, however good it is at tracing their absence. Now, this is not anything mind-warping if you've studied Seminar 17. In fact, if you take a look at page 67 of Seminar 17, I'll read it so you don't have to have the book in front of you. It's a passage that we also went over very carefully and multiple times in our previous series for this very reason, because it also captures the spirit of what Lacan thinks a scientific discourse can and should be doing, which is accurately designating the holes in semblance that put us on the path of the real. Check it out. Bottom of page 67 in Seminar 17. I say it's the sister. So recall, he's talking about sisters, the sibling relationship between truth and the real, because they are only related by this. If the most radical logical structures effectively attach themselves to this stem that is uprooted from jouissance, so here you start to hear the botanical metaphor popping again. The stem that is uprooted from sexual jouissance and put in a vase becomes the object of surplus enjoyment. That was one of the things we discussed in our previous series. We're right back there with this. Radical logical structures that would have the consistency of a scientific discourse. The inverse question arises of what corresponds to the enjoying of these conquests in logic. In other words, what would it mean to enjoy accurately finding the holes in semblance, the holes in signifying systems, and then marking them? What would it mean to get off on that at the level of a logical scientific system, is what Lacan's asking here. What type of enjoyment, in other words, is that? By God, it's the very same enjoyment that I hope you hear in my voice here at the start of Seminar 18. The inverse question arises of what corresponds to the enjoying of these conquests in logic that in our day are being made. There is this, for example, that a logical system is consistent, however, quote, weak it is. It's one of only a few places in Seminar 17 where Lacan discusses weakness. The other, more key, is on page 52, as you heard me say. It is, as they say, only by designating its force of effect, of incompleteness, where its limit is marked. To what jouissance does this way, in which the logical foundation itself proves to be opening up, correspond? In other words, what is truth here? I can't emphasize this passage enough, page 67 in Seminar 17, because it shows Lacan again trying to think the relationship between the real, scientific discourse as a statement of logical inconsistency, as a marking of one's limit, and an open-ended process that asks questions of enjoyment and truth. This passage is key for just that reason. That's why I call your attention to it. Which brings us to the spin-out. You heard me promise a big spin-out that'll then allow you to read the rest of Chapter 2 in Seminar 18 in all of its trans glory. And I encourage you to check this out. It's interesting stuff. There's been some good secondary scholarship around this topic as well. So you got some work ahead of you if you want it. The next paragraph on page 24 of Seminar 18 shows Lacan shifting from this discussion of the real relative to scientific discourse that takes as its task the naming of the whole that the real makes in semblance, that the real is in signifying field. Scientific discourse gets off on naming that whole, another reason why it's hysteric. But this, according to Lacan, doesn't slip so easily into the field of truth as it does for him here in Seminar 17. Check it out where he goes next. Page 24, Seminar 18. What is important for us in what concerns us, namely the field of truth. And why it is the field of truth only qualified as such that concerns us, I am going to try to articulate today. In what concerns us, we are dealing with something that takes into account that it differs from the position of the real in physics. So there's something about the field of truth that interests the psychoanalyst that is different from the designations of the real that we see being played out in physics. This something that resists, that is not permeable to every meaning, which is a consequence of our discourse, and which is called fantasy. And what has to be tested are its limits, its structure, the function, the relationship in a discourse of one of the terms, the objet a, the surplus enjoying, the split that is the subject, or precisely the point which is broken in the discourse of the master. This is what we have to test in its functioning, when in the completely opposite position, that in which the objet a occupies this place, it is the subject that is opposite, this barred subject, this place where it is questioned. It is here that the fantasy must take on its status which is defined by the very part of impossibility that there is in analytic questioning. This is another terrific passage. Don't get bogged down. What he's talking about here is the torsion-like Mobius strip-esque relationship between the discourse of the analyst at the level of analytic questioning and the discourse of the master. And what Lacan is pointing out here is that if you look at the discourse of the master, the lower half, where you have a barred subject, and then you've got this delta of impossibility that we're chomping at, where impotence, limitation, inconsistency, and impossibility would all find expression. And then to the right of that, you've got objet a as this designator of surplus enjoyment. Lacan's point here is that when you get to the other side of the discourse of the master, what you see is that it's the discourse of the analyst. And what has happened there is that now the analyst speaks from the position of objet a in all of its significance. Refer back to our discourse on the analyst in our previous series. And the analyst speaks from that position to the master, but not as master. The analyst speaks to them as split subject, as barred subject. In other words, at the register of the fantasy that is broken somehow in the lower part of the discourse of the master. So that's all he's really working up here. The part that I think is really key is that he is not yet willing to throw the real in with the truth. Now, this is the spin out, because from here, I'm not sure he goes on to do exactly what he says he's going to do, namely, which is to articulate all of this for us today, which is partly why I want to end here with this moment, because I think that what we have here, and the reason why Lacan can't let the real slide into truth and vice versa, why physics in its capacity and skill at marking the holes in semblance cannot be equivalent to psychoanalysts' interest in the truth, in the field of truth. It's because in Lacan's theory of discourse, they occupy two different positions. The position of truth that interests the psychoanalyst in the lower left-hand quadrant of any given discourse is distinct from the delta of impotence that divides this truth from the production of that very discourse. Now, this is clear, it is coherent, but I don't know if what I'm saying right now is accessible. It is too soon to say whether or not any of this shit is accurate. But I believe we are on point to understanding why truth is the sister of forbidden jouissance, and why forbidden jouissance is the sister of truth, why the name of the real is the sister of unconscious truth, and vice versa. It's this sibling-like relationship that we are trying to drill down on. I'm not sure if we've made any success, but by God, if the bit isn't spinning.